Have you ever noticed that when most fighters step into the ring with Shakur Stevenson, they look confident during the introductions, but by the third or fourth round, they start looking completely different. They stop throwing combinations. Their feet slow down. Instead of trying to win exchanges, they're just trying to land something clean. Even world-class fighters eventually reach the same point. They become hesitant. Welcome back to Gloves and Blood. What's interesting is that Shakur isn't knocking these guys out. He isn't overwhelming them with power, and he isn't throwing 100 punches around either. Yet somehow, he makes elite fighters look like they're fighting a problem they can't solve. That's what makes him such an interesting fighter to study. When people talk about Shakur, the conversation usually starts and ends with one word: defense. He doesn't get hit. That's true, but it's also a huge oversimplification. Defense is only the final result. The real question is, why doesn't he get hit? Is it reflexes? Is it speed? Those things definitely help, but they don't tell the whole story. If you slow his fights down and really pay attention to the small details, you start realizing that Shakur is winning exchanges long before anyone throws a punch. He's constantly making tiny decisions that force his opponents into bad positions. By the time they realize what's happening, they're already reacting instead of thinking. That's why today we're breaking down 6 reasons Shakur Stevenson has become one of the hardest fighters in the sport to beat. Just the technical habits that separate him from almost everyone else. Let's start with the skill that quietly controls everything else he does. Number 1. His control of distance. If you ask a new boxing fan what makes someone hard to hit, they'll probably say speed. If you ask an experienced coach, they'll usually give you a different answer: distance. Because if your opponent can't reach you, speed doesn't even matter. This is probably the biggest reason Shakur frustrates people. Watch one of his fights without even looking at the punches. Just focus on where he's standing. It's almost strange. He's close enough that his opponent thinks they can land, but every time they decide to throw, they're just a little too far away. That tiny gap changes everything. Look at his fight with Oscar Valdez. Valdez spent years breaking opponents down with pressure. He's excellent at closing distance and forcing exchanges. Against Shakur, it looked like he could never quite arrive. Every time Valdez stepped in behind his jab or tried to throw the left hook, Shakur had already adjusted. Sometimes it was one small step backward. Sometimes it was a slight lean. Sometimes it was just moving his lead foot 6 inches. That's all it took. To the crowd, it barely looked like movement. To Valdez, it felt like he was chasing someone who kept disappearing. That's one of the biggest misconceptions about defense. People think great defensive fighters have incredible reactions. The reality is that they often make the reaction unnecessary. Instead of slipping a punch at the last second, Shakur simply isn't standing where the punch was supposed to land. That sounds simple. It's incredibly difficult, because distance isn't something you measure once. It's changing every second. Elite fighters are constantly recalculating that distance in their heads. Very few do it as consistently as Shakur. One thing you'll notice is that he almost never backs straight up for long. A lot of fighters panic under pressure. They retreat in a straight line until they reach the ropes. Once your back touches the ropes, your options become limited. Shakur understands that. Instead of giving ground endlessly, he'll take 1 or 2 steps back, then suddenly pivot. Now everything changes. The attacker has to turn. Their feet have to reset. The angle disappears. The pressure is gone. And Shakur is standing in open space again. It feels effortless when you watch it. It isn't. Those pivots are happening because he's constantly aware of where every part of the ring is. He's not just watching the opponent. He's watching the ring itself. That's ring IQ. There's another detail that's easy to miss. Shakur rarely lets opponents decide when an exchange begins. Think about that. Most fighters react to the other man's attack. Shakur often controls when the exchange even starts. He'll inch forward just enough to tempt someone into throwing. Then the moment they commit, he's already gone. It's almost like setting a trap. Imagine trying to catch someone who's holding a string attached to your wrist. Every time you reach for them, they already know exactly how far you're going. That's what fighting Shakur looks like.
You're convinced the target is there. Then suddenly it isn't. And now you're the one out of position. This is also why his counters seem so clean. People credit his timing. His timing is excellent.
But timing becomes much easier when you already know exactly where your opponent's weight is going. If they're leaning forward, trying to reach you, they can't defend nearly as well. Now they're stretched out. Their balance is compromised. Their feet aren't underneath them anymore. Meanwhile, Shakur is perfectly balanced. His feet stay underneath his shoulders. His weight stays centered. He can punch immediately. That's why his counters don't look rushed. He's never trying to recover his balance first. He already has it. It's a small detail, but it's one of the reasons he lands cleaner than people realize. Everything starts with distance. If you control distance, you control timing. If you control timing, you control the pace. And if you control the pace, you usually control the fight. That's exactly what Shakur does. But distance alone isn't enough. The reason he's able to maintain that perfect range for 12 rounds has everything to do with what his feet are doing. And that's where the second reason starts. One of the easiest mistakes to make when watching Shakur Stevenson is focusing only on what happens from the waist up. The head movement catches your eye, the counters get clipped for highlights, and the clean shots are what people remember after the fight. But if you watch him a second time and ignore everything except his feet, the fight starts to make a lot more sense. He's almost never standing in the same place for more than a second or two. That doesn't mean he's constantly circling the ring. In fact, that's what surprises a lot of people. His movement is economical. There aren't any unnecessary laps around the ring or flashy pivots just to show he can move. Every adjustment changes something for the opponent. Take his fight against Jamel Herring. Herring was the naturally bigger man, longer, physically stronger, and had plenty of experience at the championship level. On paper, using his size should have been one of his biggest advantages. Instead, he spent most of the fight trying to square Shakur up and never really managed to do it. Whenever Herring looked ready to let his left hand go, Shakur had already changed the angle by a few inches. It wasn't dramatic enough for the crowd to react, but it was enough to force Herring to reset his feet before throwing. That reset doesn't sound important until you realize boxing is full of tiny moments like that. Every reset is time. Every extra adjustment gives your opponent another opportunity to move. At the highest level, losing even half a second can mean the exchange is already over. That's one of the reasons Shakur rarely looks rushed. He's usually making his adjustment before his opponent finishes making theirs. Watch how often he steps outside his opponent's lead foot after a jab. It's subtle, but it changes the picture completely. Suddenly, the center line has shifted. The angle for the straight left opens up, and the return fire becomes much harder to land clean. He's not relying on athleticism in those moments. He's creating positions where boxing becomes easier. That's an important distinction. A lot of gifted fighters solve problems with speed. Shakur usually solves them with positioning. Those are two very different things. Speed fades with age. Positioning doesn't. That's one of the reasons so many experienced trainers appreciate his style. It's built on habits that tend to last throughout a career instead of attributes that disappear over time. You'll also notice that he doesn't waste movement. Some defensive fighters move so much that they burn energy without realizing it. By the championship rounds, the legs aren't as sharp, the reactions slow down, and the defense starts breaking apart. Shakur doesn't have that problem very often, because he isn't making huge movements. He's making efficient ones. A 6-inch pivot is always going to cost less energy than taking 3 big steps across the ring. Over 12 rounds, those savings add up. The result is a fighter who often looks just as fresh in the 10th round as he did in the 2nd. That's not just conditioning, it's efficiency. The less unnecessary work you do, the more energy you have when the important moments arrive. There's another part of Shakur's game that usually gets overlooked because it doesn't show up on the punch statistics. Watch what he does before he throws. Sometimes he'll twitch his lead hand. Sometimes he'll dip his shoulders. Sometimes he'll shift his weight without actually committing to anything.
None of those movements are random. He's asking questions. How does the opponent react? Do they reach with the jab? Do they pull their head straight back? Do they bring both gloves high? Do they bite on every little movement? Every answer gives him another piece of information. People usually think of feints as a way to make someone flinch, but at the elite level, they're just as valuable for collecting information.
Imagine sitting across from someone playing cards. You don't know exactly what they're holding, but every expression, every hesitation, every glance gives you another clue. That's what Shakur is doing in the ring. By the middle rounds, he has a much clearer picture of his opponent's habits than they have of his. The fight against Edwin de Los Santos is a good example. A lot of fans criticize that performance because there weren't many dramatic exchanges, but if you watch it from a tactical perspective, you can see what Shakur was doing. He wasn't interested in giving de Los Santos the type of fight he wanted. He kept changing the look, showing different feints, varying the rhythm, and refusing to become predictable. From the outside it looked cautious. From inside the ring, it was calculated. Every time de Los Santos hesitated, Shakur had accomplished something without throwing a punch. Hesitation is one of the most valuable things a defensive fighter can create. Once a boxer starts second-guessing their own timing, the entire offense begins to slow down. The jab isn't as confident. The combinations become shorter. Instead of throwing 3 punches, they throw 1. Instead of stepping in behind the jab, they wait another second. That hesitation doesn't happen because they're afraid. It happens because the information they're getting keeps changing. One exchange tells them the jab is available. The next exchange tells them it isn't. Now they're stuck trying to solve a puzzle while someone else is already 2 moves ahead. That's where Shakur is at his best. He doesn't overwhelm people with volume. He overwhelms them with decisions. Every few seconds they're forced to choose. Should I pressure? Should I jab? Should I wait? Should I cut the ring off? Should I throw now? The more decisions you force someone to make, the slower they become. Meanwhile, Shakur's own decisions stay relatively simple because he's already narrowed down the possibilities. That's why he often looks so calm. He's not processing chaos. He's creating order for himself while creating confusion for the other guy. And once an opponent starts thinking instead of reacting naturally, the fight usually begins slipping away from them. There's something you notice after watching enough Shakur Stevenson fights. The frustration doesn't show up all at once. It builds little by little. A fighter comes into the ring with a clear game plan. Maybe they're planning to pressure him. Maybe they want to establish the jab early. Or maybe they've spent weeks preparing combinations they believe will break through his defense. For the first round or 2, they stick to that plan. Then the fight starts drifting in a different direction. The jab isn't landing the way it did in training camp. The right hand keeps falling short. Every combination seems to end with Shakur already standing somewhere else. At that point, something changes. Instead of boxing the way they practiced, they're trying to solve the problem standing in front of them. That's exactly where Shakur wants the fight to go. One of the biggest compliments you can give a boxer is saying they make elite opponents fight out of character. Shakur has done that repeatedly throughout his career. Oscar Valdez is a perfect example. Anyone who watched Valdez before that fight knows he built his reputation on pressure, combinations, and relentless work rate. He's at his best when he gets opponents exchanging with him. Against Shakur, those opportunities almost never came. As the rounds went on, Valdez became more selective, throwing fewer combinations and spending more time trying to figure out where the openings had gone. It wasn't because he forgot how to fight. It was because the opportunities he normally sees weren't there. That's one of the hardest things to appreciate unless you've boxed yourself. When every attack gets interrupted, even subtly, confidence starts disappearing. You begin wondering whether you're reading the distance correctly. You hesitate for a split second before letting your hands go. At this level, that split second is enough for the opening to disappear. That's why Shakur doesn't need to dominate every exchange. He only needs to keep making the other man question the next one. The mental side of boxing often gets overlooked because it's impossible to measure. You can count punches, knockdowns, and rounds, but you can't put a number on hesitation. You can't measure uncertainty. Yet those things decide fights all the time. Some fighters wear opponents down with body shots. Others do it with pressure. Shakur often does it by making every decision feel complicated. By the middle rounds, opponents aren't just reacting to what he does. They're reacting to what they think he might do. That's a dangerous place to be because now you're fighting possibilities instead of reality. Another reason this works so well is that Shakur stays remarkably disciplined. A lot of talented fighters eventually convince themselves they have to prove something. They start chasing highlight reel knockouts, forcing exchanges that don't need to happen, or taking unnecessary risks because they want to entertain the crowd. Shakur has never seemed interested in fighting that way. If controlling the pace wins in the round, that's what he'll do. If the safest option is taking a small step back instead of exchanging, he'll take it without hesitation. Some fans mistake that for being overly cautious, but inside a boxing gym, discipline is one of the most respected qualities a fighter can have. Every trainer teaches fundamentals. Very few fighters have the patience to stick to them once the bell rings. Shakur does. That's why his style looks so consistent from fight to fight. Whether he's facing a pressure fighter, a counterpuncher, or someone with a significant reach advantage, his identity doesn't change. He adjusts to different opponents without abandoning the principles that made him successful in the first place. There's a lesson in that beyond boxing. The highest level of any sport usually isn't about doing more. It's about doing fewer things, but doing them exceptionally well. Shakur isn't trying to show that he has 20 different weapons. He keeps coming back to the same fundamentals: distance, positioning, balance, timing, and patience. Those skills might not always create viral highlights, but over 12 rounds they solve almost every problem an opponent can present. That's why calling him just a defensive fighter misses the point. Defense is simply what people notice first. The real story is everything happening underneath it. The footwork that keeps him balanced. The positioning that closes one opening while creating another. The feints that gather information before the real exchanges even begin. The patience to wait for mistakes instead of forcing opportunities. And perhaps most importantly, the discipline to trust those habits even when the crowd wants something different. When all of those pieces come together, you get a fighter who's incredibly difficult to beat, not because he's invincible, but because he gives opponents so few chances to capitalize on the stakes. Every great boxer has strengths. Some rely on power. Some rely on speed. Some rely on relentless pressure. Shakur's greatest strength is that every part of his game supports the next. His feet improve his defense. His defense creates counters. His counters make opponents hesitant. That hesitation makes controlling the distance even easier. It's a cycle that keeps repeating itself throughout the fight. That's why so many of his performances follow a familiar pattern. The early rounds are competitive, then the pace gradually shifts in his favor as his opponent becomes more cautious and less certain of what they're seeing. By the championship rounds, it often feels as though Shakur is dictating every exchange. Not because he's throwing the most punches, not because he's hurting his opponent with every shot, but because he's quietly taken control of the fight in ways that are easy to miss unless you're looking for them. And that's what makes studying Shakur Stevenson so fascinating. He reminds us that boxing has never been just about power or aggression. At its highest level, it's a game of positioning, timing, problem-solving, and discipline. The punches are only one part of the equation. Everything that happens before they're thrown is just as important. The fighters who understand that tend to have long careers. The fighters who master it become champions. And the rare few who can make world-class opponents look ordinary earn a reputation that's almost impossible to ignore. Whether you love his style or wish he took more risks, there's no denying the level of skill it takes to perform the way he does against elite competition. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more deep dives into the techniques, habits, and hidden details that separate good fighters from truly elite ones, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and let me know which boxer you'd like to see analyzed next. Until then, keep studying the sweet science, because the smallest details are usually the ones that decide the biggest fights.